And thank you to all of you for spending an hour of your morning with me. I really appreciate it. So turning to the Jewish world of Alexander Hamilton, Hamilton was a wanderer in search of promised land. When he left his home in the Caribbean at the age of 18 and set sail for America, Hamilton fixed his eyes on a new Jerusalem. After his mother's tragic death, the courts denied him his inheritance, his birthright, and he had to rely on his keen financial and linguistic acumen to survive. His is a story of dispossession, a story of exodus, a story of the search for a homeland. His story is, in so many respects, the story of the Jewish people. But Hamilton wasn't merely similar to Jewish immigrants. I believe that in all likelihood, Hamilton himself was a Jewish immigrant. And uncovering the truth about Hamilton's origins isn't just a matter of historical curiosity. It provides the key to unlocking why, in his American adulthood, Hamilton emerges as a champion of religious liberty and an opponent of anti-Semitism. To make the case that Alexander Hamilton, in all likelihood, had a Jewish background, according to traditional Jewish law, halakha, I would have to make the case that his mother was Jewish. And we know that his mother, Rachel, was not born a Jew. And so I would have to demonstrate the likelihood that his mother converted to Judaism prior to Alexander's birth. My case for her conversion begins in 1745 on a sun-kissed island in the Caribbean called St. Croix. Today, St. Croix is part of the U.S. Virgin Islands, but it was at that time a Danish colony. And it's there that Rachel meets and marries Johann Michael Levine. Now, Hamilton scholars have told us for generations that Johann Levine was not Jewish because, supposedly, he's not identified in the Danish land records and census registers from St. Croix as a Jew. The problem is no scholar had actually bothered consulting this Danish source material from the Caribbean. I learned enough Danish to read through these records. I went through 3,000 of them. What did I find? Well, it turns out that these scholars were right. Johann Levine is not identified as a Jew in the records, which would be problematic for my thesis today had I not also uncovered that every other known Jew on the island was also not identified as Jewish in these records. Here we have one example of a document originally from the Caribbean, had been transported to the Danish National Archives in Copenhagen. And here we have Moses Mendez, a known Sephardic Jew living on St. Croix. And nowhere in this record does the word Joder, which is the Danish word for Jew, appear. Nowhere is his religious identity noted. Religion wasn't a category in these records. And I have an image of me here outside the Danish National Archives and another one expressing shock at my findings. Well, what else do we know about Johann Levine? Well, his last name was Levine. His last name actually appears in a variety of spellings, including Lavian, Levin, and Lewin, spellings that match letter for letter how Jews of Levitic descent spelled their surnames in the 18th century. We know that he worked as a merchant, which was a profession that was disproportionately Jewish. He was significantly more likely to conduct business with Jews at a time when Jews often conducted business among themselves. He had moved to St. Croix from another Caribbean island that was home to a large Jewish population. And Hamilton's own grandson, in the historical record, explicitly identified Levine as a rich Danish Jew. So if Johann Levine, in all likelihood, was Jewish, and there's not a shred of evidence to the contrary, is it possible that Rachel converted to Judaism before marrying Johann Levine? Well, consider this. They have a child a year after their wedding named Peter Levine, and they do not have this child infant baptized. Now, years later, as an adult, Peter undertakes an adult baptism in order to join an Anglican church. Well, Anglicans practice infant baptism. Why would Anglicans baptize an adult? Well, my Anglican friends tell me there are three possible reasons why any given adult might be baptized as part of the process of joining an Anglican church. One possibility is that the person had grown up Christian, but in a sect that only practices adult baptism or believer's baptism. So is it possible that Peter Levine is actually raised Christian, but was in a sect that only practices believer's baptism? He simply hadn't been baptized yet, and that's why he needs this adult baptism. It's not possible, because every single Christian denomination on St. Croix at that time categorically practiced infant baptism. A second possibility is that the person had been baptized either as an adult already or in infancy, but they had been given a non-Trinitarian baptism. So the Anglicans would accept a Trinitarian baptism from another denomination as valid, but not a non-Trinitarian baptism. Is it possible that Peter Levine grew up Christian, had a non-Trinitarian baptism, and then he needed to do this second baptism to join the Anglican Church? It's not possible, because every Christian denomination on St. Croix in these years was uniformly practicing Trinitarian baptisms. The third reason, the only one that plausibly explains why Peter would have needed this adult baptism, is if he was converting to Christianity. Now, Hamilton scholars who are mired in the assumption that Rachel, Johann, and Peter were all cradle-to-grave Christians are baffled by Peter's need for an adult baptism. But if Johann Levine actually was Jewish and Rachel converted to Judaism before she married him, then that would make their son Peter a Jew. And his need for this adult baptism, this long-standing mystery that has befuddled generations of Hamilton scholars, is suddenly easily explained. But that is just one piece of evidence for you to consider. Now, after Peter is born, Rachel and Johann, their marriage deteriorates. He has her imprisoned for infidelity. And when she gets out of prison, she absconds from the island of St. Croix, and she winds up on the British Caribbean island of Nevis. Oh, and there's one other document I forgot to show you here, which is, and it's going to be hard to read this one. This is from the Anglican Church Register from St. Croix, and every single person on this register is an infant except for Peter Levine. You see, this says 1769, and Peter Levine, born in 1746. He's the only person on this register who's not an infant. So she winds up on this British Caribbean island called Nevis, and it is here on Nevis that Rachel ends up bearing Alexander out of wedlock to a Scottish colonist named James Hamilton. Now, there's no reason to think that James Hamilton was Jewish, but there are compelling reasons to think that Rachel chooses to raise her son Alexander in her adopted faith of Judaism. Now, if Alexander were born Jewish, we would expect that he would be circumcised. If he was born Christian, we would expect that he would be baptized. Unfortunately, there are no surviving circumcision records for any of the Jews that were living on Nevis at the time. There are extant baptismal records which show no entry for Alexander. And even more compelling than that, his mother enrolls Alexander in a Jewish school where he begins rudimentary study of the Torah in the original Hebrew. When he was little, his teacher would put him on a table so they would be eye level, and he would recite to her the 10 Commandments in Hebrew. Now, I didn't discover these facts. It's long been known that there's no baptismal record for him. It's long been known that he was enrolled in this Jewish school. So how have Hamilton scholars made sense of these curiosities? They say, well, he was born out of wedlock, and so he must have been denied an infant baptism on account of his illegitimacy. And if he can't be baptized into the church, he can't go to the church school, and that must be why he goes to the Jewish school. This is a very neat and tidy explanation, and one that might be problematic for my thesis today had I not gone down to Nevis and gone through those church records, unlike other Hamilton scholars, and found that actually children born out of wedlock were routinely infant baptized on Nevis and indeed throughout the Caribbean. So here's just one example I unearthed in the archives from the Parish Register of St. George's on Nevis. And you see in this very first entry here, August 12th, baptized Daniel, son of Sarah Harris, illegitimate. And this is all over the records. And so we have precious little grounds for thinking that Hamilton's out-of-wedlock birth posed any obstacle to his participation in church life, and therefore precious little grounds to think that it goes any way towards explaining his enrollment at a Jewish school. Moreover, Hamilton scholars make a critical error in assuming that a Jewish school would have educated a child who was seen as Christian, especially in that time and place. Jewish schools were, of course, religious instruments. They existed to instill in Jewish children a strong sense of Jewish identity, to cultivate in them a shared sense of Jewish peoplehood with their co-religionists spread out across the diaspora, to give them the knowledge and the customs they need to live lives as observant Jews. And so it would be odd to find a child who was Christian attending a Jewish school at that time. In fact, it would be more than odd. It would be unprecedented. I have never found, and no scholar of 18th century Jewish education I've ever spoken to has ever found a single recorded instance of a Christian child attending a Jewish school in that time period. Moreover, Hamilton scholars make a mistake in thinking that a Jewish school would have educated a Christian child because they misunderstand the nature of Jewish-Christian relations at that time. And I want to take a few minutes to unpack this part of the argument because it's really central to the book. In the 18th century, the Caribbean was the center of Jewish life in the Western Hemisphere. Some islands were 40% Jewish of the free population. On Nevis, it's 25% Jewish. Right? And as I like to joke with my grandma, these aren't Boca Raton numbers, but they're respectable, right? Now, and she really does live in Boca, and she thinks I only make that joke when I give book talks in Boca, but I do it nationally. So there are more Jews living on a single Dutch island in the Caribbean than in the entire continent of North America. Why are there so many Jews on these islands? One word: sugar. The tropical heat and rich soil of the Caribbean made these islands ideal for cultivating sugar, the ultimate cash crop of the 18th century. Sugar is also the reason there's such a prolific slave trade at that time. Now, Jews were particularly well positioned to take advantage of the opportunities presented by the sugar trade. Jews were skilled in commerce. They were fluent in multiple languages. They were embedded in trade networks with fellow Jews on both sides of the Atlantic. Those European powers that were willing to stomach some kind of Jewish presence on their Caribbean colonies stood to profit for that tolerance. So the extent to which Jews are accepted in places like Nevis, it's not religious diversity being celebrated necessarily. Jews are begrudgingly accepted in the name of cash crop cultivation. The status of Jews in other minority groups, including Catholics and Quakers, was always precarious, especially when islands reach peak sugar productivity and the need for further immigration wanes. Now, the configuration of Jewish life in Nevis helps underscore that Jews were a people apart. Jews were not evenly dispersed throughout Charlestown, the main port town where Hamilton grows up. They are concentrated in a Jewish quarter. And this Jewish quarter, it's not the most desirable real estate on the island. It's sandwiched between the jail on one side and a mosquito-infested backwater called the Bogs on the other. And this configuration is telling. It's because if you look at many European communities at the time, Jews are largely living, sometimes under the coercion of law, in their own districts. In other words, Jews and Christians aren't coming to the Caribbean and creating a whole new set of social and spatial relationships between the two faith groups. They are recreating patterns they already know from the old world. Patterns designed to ensure a degree of segregation, religious, cultural, and geographic, between Jewish and Christian life. And Jews on Nevis had already seen Catholics kicked out of the island, and they had seen their co-religionists kicked out of some nearby French islands. And so the prospect that they were going to continue in Nevis in perpetuity was hardly a sure thing. Now, Jews were often easy scapegoats in troubled economic times. Jewish merchants were often accused, often unfairly, of stealing bread from the mouths of Jewish children through supposedly deceptive trading practices, relying on old stereotypes dating back centuries in Europe. So why have I taken such pains to reconstruct the fraught tenor of Jewish-Christian relations in the 18th century Caribbean? Because it strains believability to think that amid these dicey politics, the Jews of Nevis would have educated a child who was seen as Christian. The Jews would have only educated Alexander if they had seen him as one of their own. The politics with their neighbors were too dicey, their continued residence on Nevis too doubtful, the broader cultural and religious and political environment too fraught for Jews to have otherwise hazarded such an unprecedented risk. Now, when Hamilton is around 11, he and his mother leave Nevis and they wind up on St. Croix. So she's returning to St. Croix for Alexander. It's his first time. And she runs a store out of the first floor of a building in the main town there called Christiansted. They live together on the second story. And this arrangement continues for a couple years until both mother and son fall deathly ill. They suffer together in a single bed. Alexander pulls back from the brink, but in February of 1768, Rachel Levine takes her final breath. And the details of Rachel's passing and burial may be instructive for our purposes today. For one, Rachel is not buried in the church cemetery. Now, if you're Jewish, at that time on St. Croix, burial in a Jewish cemetery wasn't an option. St. Croix wasn't home to the larger Jewish populations that could be found on the likes of Nevis and Curacao and Jamaica and Barbados. St. Croix was home to just a few scattered Jews. And so your only option was to be buried at the home of a relative. And in fact, Rachel is buried at her sister's estate. Interestingly, she is buried under the name Levine. She had not seen Johann for 18 years, and yet she keeps his surname until her dying day, hinting at an abiding connection to a Jewish identity. Now, a number of Hamilton scholars note that a Christian clergyman performed the funeral rites at her funeral. And this might be problematic for my thesis as well, except there's not a shred of evidence to support it. If you look through every Hamilton biography that makes this claim, and you look in the footnotes, they all just cite another Hamilton biography that makes this claim. It is wholly circular. It is yet one more fiction in the mythology that has continued to shroud our understanding of Hamilton's early years. Now, all of this raises a question about if Hamilton, in all likelihood, grew up with a Jewish identity, when does he start identifying as Christian? Now, I suspect that any Jewish identity he may have had dies with his mother. His mother is gone, and he's no longer living on Nevis, home to the sizable Jewish community that had educated him. With his familial and communal ties to Judaism severed, it would be unsurprising if a youth as plucky and precocious as Alexander Hamilton opted to not saddle himself with a religious status that would have confined him to second-class citizenship. A recently unearthed court transcript from the Caribbean lends credence to my theory that, one, Hamilton was in fact identifying as Christian in his teenage years after his mother's death, and two, he was a newcomer to the Christian faith. So Hamilton, from the ages of 13 to 18, that is from the time of his mother's death until he leaves the islands, he continues to live on St. Croix as an orphan, and he's working for an import-export company. And I'll mention as a sidelight to all of that, in his work for this import-export company, he is thrust into the midst of these transatlantic trading networks. And so when we think about other American founders, Jefferson and Madison, they're growing up on plantations. They are versed in an agrarian form of economy. Hamilton is in a port town. He is learning about credit, debt, trade, finance. He is honing all the skills that would uniquely position him to become the visionary of America's financial future. And given the prominence of Jewish traders in the Caribbean, it is all but certain that Hamilton came into regular contact with the kinds of Jewish merchants with whom he'd later collaborate in building New York's financial system. But getting back to this recently unearthed court transcript, Hamilton, he's 17 years old. he's called to give testimony in a business dispute between his employer and a merchant. And Hamilton is brought on the witness stand and assessed for his competency to give sworn testimony on the New Testament. And the lawyer asks, well, how do you identify? And Hamilton says, I'm Anglican. And the lawyer says, so you've taken communion? And Hamilton admits that no, he's never taken communion. And this would be quite an oddity for a 17-year-old who's effectively an adult by the standards of that day. The Book of Common Prayer governing Anglican rites specifies that the rituals of confirmation and communion are to take place in childhood. It would be an oddity if Hamilton had actually grown up Anglican that he wouldn't have had communion by the age of 17. In fact, it's such an oddity that the judge bars him from giving sworn testimony, his insufficient bona fides as a Christian. Here is the transcript, and don't worry if the writing's too small to read it, because it's written in Danish, and it's also written in a form of archaic Gothic Danish that modern Danish readers can't read. There's a reason this book took me 7.5 years to research and write, even though it's just shy of 200 pages. So in this transcript, I'm going to come back to this transcript in a second. Forgive me. I'm trying to go no notes today. Okay. So Hamilton continues working on this island until a devastating hurricane brutalizes the Eastern Caribbean. Its eye passes directly over his town on St. Croix. Amid the twin horrors of gale-force winds and 70-foot waves, ships from the harbor are flung inland, homes are reduced to rubble, the lives of hundreds of islanders are summarily extinguished. Now, the very best description we have of anyone who survived the storm came from the pen of none other than the 18-year-old Alexander Hamilton. And his letter describing surviving the storm is published in a local island paper. And according to island lore, the locals were so taken by his precocious facility with language that they passed the hat for a worthy cause. They raised money to send him to America for college. And he enrolls at what at the time was known as King's College, what gets renamed after the Revolution, Columbia, as we now know it today, Columbia University in the city of New York. And when Hamilton gets to New York, he does something really interesting. He lies about his age. Every piece of evidence we have from the Caribbean, including his own testimony in this court case, places his year of birth at 1754. And here I'm zooming in on this document, and I know it's a little bit blurry, but you can see here this number is a 1 and a 7. And this is Hamilton in his own words claiming in 1771 to be 17 years old. And we have many other pieces of evidence placing his year of birth in 1754. He gets to New York, he says he's born in 1757. Why would he lie about his age? Well, King's College skewed young. The average incoming freshman is only 15. And so it would be unsurprising if Hamilton, the outsider, Hamilton, the orphan, Hamilton, the West Indian, decides to obscure his true age to fit in with the other students. And the fact that Hamilton is diminutive in stature and boyish in face would have made the deception that much easier to carry out. And more importantly, he was able to get away with it for the rest of his life without any Caribbean contemporary ever outing him. What Hamilton probably didn't think through when he gets to New York is that if he lies about his age for consistency's sake, he's going to have to maintain that lie for the rest of his life. And he does so successfully without anyone outing his prevarication. This makes it that much more plausible that Hamilton would have been equally willing and equally able to conceal other elemental aspects of his Caribbean upbringing, including a possible Jewish heritage. Notably, Hamilton never spoke about his background, even to his own family, save for one memory. The one memory he ever shared with his children of his upbringing was his time at the Jewish school. It is the one cryptic clue that he bequeaths to us. So let's take a step back and ask what all of this adds up to. There are people in corners of academia who will tell you, poor Wancher, he's unhinged, he's gone rogue this time. He's a caricature from New Jersey, trafficking in Jewish delusion. But I take comfort in the words of one of Hamilton's rivals, John Adams, who once said famously, facts are stubborn things. So let's take an inventory of some relevant facts. Johann Levine had a Jewish surname, a Jewish profession, conducted business with Jews, came from an island with a Jewish community, is identified by Hamilton's own grandson as a Jew. Rachel marries him, and they have this son, Peter, who is not infant baptized, which was universal practice for island Christians. Peter later undertakes an adult baptism under conditions that make little sense unless he was converting to Christianity. She has this other son, Alexander, for whom we also have no baptismal record, whom she enrolls at a Jewish school at a time when Jewish schools exclusively educated Jewish children. She is buried under the name Levine. She is not buried in the church cemetery. And Hamilton, later as a teenager, while professing to be Christian, has never taken communion. By the way, even on his deathbed with Aaron Burr's bullet in his spine, he had still never taken communion. And Hamilton gets to New York, and he proves perfectly willing and perfectly able to conceal foundational aspects of his Caribbean heritage. If we insist on adhering to the unfounded article of faith that these people were all cradle-to-grave Christians, these are all really inconvenient facts. Hamilton biographers have glossed over these facts or used words such as shocking, mysterious, and inexplicable to describe them. Well, as my mother likes to say when things don't quite add up, that dog don't hunt. She's a Jew from Montreal. I'm not sure where she picked up that expression. She's never been south of Philadelphia, to my knowledge, but she does say it. So, and I even had a slide for her. So, and here we have Columbia, what becomes Columbia after the war. Now, we've got a very bright audience that comes to this conference. People who, through the rigor of classical education, have cultivated a healthy sense of skepticism about new claims, as right they should. And you might be thinking to yourself, poor Wancher, if this were true, if this were somehow possibly true, we'd already know. How could a secret this significant about an American figure this iconic remain hidden for this long? It's actually not that surprising for a number of reasons. For one, Hamilton himself, as I mentioned, maintained a lifelong silence about his Caribbean past. For a statesman whose acceptance into the upper echelons of American civic life required at least a nominal pretense to a Christian identity, remaining taciturn about any Jewish roots would have been prudent, to say the least. Moreover, the task of reconstructing Hamilton's esoteric childhood, it's not just a peripheral endeavor for the typical Hamilton scholar who has followed the lead of their subject in glossing over his early years. They're entranced by the high drama of his American adulthood, the Revolution, the Constitutional Convention. To the extent that they have engaged the question of his childhood, it's a pretty recent endeavor. So even a basic fact like his mother's name remained unknown to scholars until the 20th century. It should come as little surprise that his religious upbringing is an underdeveloped field of study. Moreover, the typical Hamilton scholar has the luxury, if they're writing about his adult years, of using the 27-volume published edition of Hamilton's Works and Letters, and you have every document throughout his American years. You could write an excellent biography of Hamilton without ever leaving ASU's library. But if you want to write about his Caribbean origins, you're looking at documents scattered across remote Caribbean islands, and in many cases also the European capitals of the countries that colonized those islands. And you're dealing with documents not just in Danish, but in French, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch. I'm forgetting a couple others. I've had to get research assistants who are study abroad students from all these different languages to help me translate this stuff. And they really loved it, actually. It was a great experience. But this is a really onerous task, far too onerous for the typical Hamilton biographer whose main interest is the Revolution, the Constitutional Convention, his role as Treasury Secretary. It shouldn't strike us as terribly remote that elemental facts about even an iconic figure have remained hidden for hundreds of years. Take, for example, Thomas Jefferson. For a couple centuries, rumors that he had fathered children with Sally Hemings were lent little to no credence in academic circles. But in the last 25 or 30 years, the work of Annette Gordon-Reed, who won a Pulitzer Prize for her work on the Hemings family, combined with new DNA testing, shows a very significant likelihood that Jefferson fathered children with Sally Hemings. Similarly, Hamilton's Jewish roots would be no less real for having evaded our attention for so long. So, why does this story matter beyond just mere curiosity? Because this Caribbean background informs Hamilton's long-neglected role as a champion for American Jewry against the forces of anti-Semitism in those crucial early years of the American Republic. In Hamilton's adulthood, while he unequivocally identifies as Christian, he marries a devout Christian woman, in Elizabeth Schuyler, Hamilton is forging the path for religious equality, including at his alma mater. He's an influential alumnus of what was called King's. They rename it Columbia after the war. You can't fight a war against a monarchy and have your college named King's. It would be unseemly, so they changed it to Columbia, which sounded like a good American name to them. And Hamilton rewrites the college charter in ways that are very interesting. First, he does away with mandatory forms of Christian worship for undergrads, even though there are no non-Christian undergrads at the college. He seems to be trying to forge the way for students like him, but for students, in a sense, unlike him, who might have been outwardly Jewish. He changes the requirement for the college presidency so that Jews are eligible to be college presidents. Now, if you look at other colonial-era colleges, like Rutgers or Brown, they don't open up their college presidencies to non-Christians until the 20th century. Hamilton is 150 years ahead of his time. He also puts the first Jew on the board of an American college. There had been higher education in America since the founding of Harvard in the 1630s. Never before had a Jew sat on the board of a college. And there wouldn't be another Jew on the board until the 20th century of Columbia. And it's a name some of you might know, especially if there's anyone with a legal background, Benjamin Cardozo. And this at a time when it was widely and absurdly believed that the Jewish religion actually encourages Jews to lie under oath in courts of law. This was an old anti-Semitic stereotype that had deep roots in the old world and had migrated over to the new. Now, this case over a period of years got appealed on appeal up until the highest tribunal in the state of New York, called the Court of Errors. And this court is unlike anything we have in America today because it combines all three branches of government. So the justices of the state Supreme Court, the members of the state Senate, and the Attorney General would sit together as a jury, and whoever got the most votes won. Now, in Gouverneur Morris's closing argument, he makes a base attack on Hamilton's witnesses. He alludes to them as these Jew witnesses, and he says flatly, and I quote, "Jews are not to be believed upon oath." Now, the next day, a large crowd gathers in the courthouse gallery to see how Hamilton, ever the relentless fighter, would respond. What Hamilton understood was that this case was no longer just about a dispute between merchants. At stake was the very meaning of the Republic. The question of whether American democracy would be blind to religion spoke to the heart of the Revolution and its radical promise of equality. The fact that a statesman as venerated as Morris had resorted to scoring political points with anti-Semitism suggested that perhaps the inspired rhetoric of the Revolution was little more than a facade masking discrimination. But Hamilton would not so readily relinquish his belief in equality in the nation that he had fought to create. Hamilton, in his closing argument, he points to Gouverneur Morris, and he says, and I quote, "Has he forgotten what this race once were when under the immediate prophecy of God himself, they were selected as the witnesses of his miracles and charged with the spirit of prophecy? Were not the witnesses of that pure and holy, happy and heaven-approved faith?" Hamilton goes on to say that no one should be judged because of the manner in which they worship. In Hamilton's own words, and again I quote, "Be the injured party Jew or Gentile, Christian or pagan, foreign or native, justice clothes him in her mantle, in whose presence all differences of faiths and births passions, and prejudices, all are called upon to acknowledge and revere justice's supremacy. My friends, it can be easy, perhaps, to overlook the extraordinary character of these remarks. After Jews had suffered the contempt of all ages and nations, here was a founding father demanding that in an American courtroom, a Jew and a Gentile stand equal before the law. Here is where we find the promise of the revolution made real. Here is where we find the radicalism of Alexander Hamilton. Before we turn to questions, I want to say in closing that there are striking similarities between the story of the Jewish people and Hamilton's own. Jewish tradition teaches that after Jews were robbed of the land that God had promised Abraham, and amid the resulting diaspora, Jews were outsiders in other societies. In many places where Jews could not own land, Jews had to be cultural intermediaries, tradesmen between societies, people who cultivated linguistic and financial acumen by dint of their marginality. So it was with Hamilton. He, too, knew what it meant to live on the margins. He, too, relied on his skills in commerce and languages in order to survive. And like so many Jews who made it to America in these early years of the Republic, he, too, tried to find in this new republic his new Jerusalem. Hamilton once wrote of the Jewish people, and again I quote, "The history of the Jews is and has been entirely out of the ordinary course of human experience. Is it not then a fair conclusion that the cause is an extraordinary one, that it is the effect of some great providential plan?" End quote. Perhaps Hamilton saw some divine intervention at play in his own unlikely rise from Caribbean obscurity to American founder. It has been said that Hamilton was a modernizer, and so it was with Jews. Indeed, many people were discomfited by Hamilton and his Jewish allies precisely because their outsiders helped make them modernizers. In a world that was largely agrarian, Hamilton and his Jewish friends flocked to urban life. In a world that was largely rural, they were drawn to trade and commerce. In a world where loyalties often lay with your local state first and the country at large second, Hamilton and his Jewish compatriots believed in the promise of a unified American nation. You know, if you want to see a monument to Thomas Jefferson, you can go out to the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and there you will find carved from white marble a beautiful memorial honoring the author of the Declaration of Independence. If you want to see a monument to Hamilton, look all around you every day. We are living in the world that he envisioned. What Hamilton understood was that the American future belonged not to the children of plantation aristocrats, it belonged to the enterprising. It belonged to the cosmopolitan. It belonged to the entrepreneurial. It belonged to the outsider. It belonged to people like him. It belonged to people like his Jewish friends. If Jews were not yet fully accepted in the America of Hamilton's day, they surely could be in the America of Hamilton's dream. Thank you.